Welcome to part 2 of the Marine Carburetor tuning series. I know everyone's been looking forward to this episode for quite some time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to it. Today we are working on a Volvo Penta 5-liter. You may have seen this motor from a prior rebuild series that I was working on. Take a look here. Ooh, I tell you what, this flame arrestor is dirty. We need to go ahead and clean that up before reinstalling it. All right, let's take a look at this electric choke and see how it's set up. You remember the little notch I was talking about? You can kind of see it right there. It is set to sit on the third index. And this specific carburetor in the past, when I've been turning it on, hasn't had very many issues really at all starting, and it idles up pretty well. Looking around at our admixture screws, or air mixture screws, they look like they're all right. Maybe a little bit of leaking going on them. May need to look at getting this carburetor rebuilt, but probably after the season is over. Now, the most important piece here is, where are we going to pull vacuum? As you saw in the part 1 series, you need that vacuum gauge, and this is where tuning these air mixture screws comes into play. Is we have to find a place to pull vacuum off of. Very important. This 5-liter, believe it or not, has plenty of places to pull vacuum from. It actually has over here a dedicated thread and hose that attaches to this little guy, and essentially you can go ahead and loosen this one here and put a T in there, right? Put a T in between this fitting and this hose, and you can pull vacuum that way. There's also a vacuum line that goes from right underneath the metering valve, and it goes into this choke. The only thing is, if you decide to use this as a way to get your vacuum, you better make sure you have a really small hose to tee in on, because your standard size hose that comes with the kit will not work. So that's what the problem with using this one is going to be, is that hose, quite honestly, is just too small. But yeah, there is a little fitting underneath this carburetor where you can plug into. This model does. The 4160, or the carburetor from the first series, actually doesn't have a port underneath like this one does. All right, which means we're likely going to use this guy right here to pull vacuum off of. Now, what some people do is, instead of putting a T in, they actually just put their vacuum gauge directly up to that, which will cause a little bit of a vacuum leak here, because keep in mind, this is connected to your PCV valve, which lines over here, and there's actually a port on the base of the carburetor that plugs into. So you're going to get some false readings if you don't have it teed in. So I recommend teeing, using a T instead of just plugging directly in here. You'll get similar results, but keep in mind, as we're adjusting and we're looking for the most precise amount of vacuum from the manifold, we want to make sure we're getting it just as if everything was plugged in normally. We're just teeing in to kind of borrow the values of what the vacuum is here. So let's go ahead and take a shot of our vacuum gauge and how we're going to pull that vacuum. Now, hopefully you remember this little guy from the part 1 of this series. You see I've cut 2 different size hoses that came with the kit. We'll need that. All right. We'll need our vacuum gauge, and we've got a few different fittings. If you saw earlier how I said you technically could just plug into that vacuum line, that's how you would do it. And like I said, you're going to get similar results, but I don't recommend just pulling directly off of it. It's easier to just get the most accurate reading possible and just tee into it. And I'll show you what that looks like now that we've got everything torn apart. There's some other little fittings in here you technically could use as well on some of the other applications, but for this video with the 5 liter, we're not going to use these other fittings, but these are going to be the 2 that you technically could use. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to tee out of that valve in the back there. Take a look. So we've successfully propped up the gauge. I used a piece of rope here to kind of hold it up. Now, remember that tee that I was talking about? We've got the line that comes out of the manifold. We've got one side going to the gauge, all right? And then this goes into its normal apparatus here, this little guy. So we're gonna be pulling vacuum just as if everything was normally set up, right? We're just gonna be able to tell what the vacuum is. Now, another thing that I'm gonna recommend as well, so we can get the curb idle speed set right, is I'm gonna disconnect the throttle, at least for this purpose, so we can properly adjust the speed to what it's supposed to be. And then if we need to shorten or lengthen the cable afterwards, we can do that as needed. But for the purpose of this video, you're gonna see me disconnect that so we can properly adjust that curb idle screw there as needed. Now that we've got the vacuum gauge propped up and ready to go, what we're gonna do to tune this is we're gonna start off with that baseline I was talking about here, right? Remember, we're gonna thread this all the way in clockwise, and then we're gonna go ahead and back this off 1.5. See if I can get my screwdriver in there. All right, so just take a visual where it is right now. Okay, there's 1.5. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other side. 1 full turn around. All right, there's 1.5. Right about there. Okay, that's gonna be our starting point with the air mixture screws on both sides of the metering block. And we've disconnected the throttle cable. Now, in order to get yours started, you may need to connect it to kind of give it some gas, right? Or go ahead and adjust your choke to make it richer so it stays on longer. You have 2 ways to do this, but for the purpose of this check and this test, go ahead and keep it on just for right now. But once you've got your whole setup warmed up, go ahead and remove that. All right, so we're looking at the motor running. It's currently at 500. Our target is going to be between 650 to 700, and 500 isn't going to cut it. So what we need to do is go to the back of the motor here. Now, let's go ahead and grab that flathead screwdriver, and we're going to go to the curb idle speed screw here. And we're going to either turn it clockwise to increase the RPMs or counterclockwise to decrease them. Now, what I'm doing is I've got one hand on the screwdriver and I'm turning it, and I'm watching the RPM gauge from where I'm sitting. And as I adjust the curb idle speed, I'm going to give it some throttle to make sure that we're going to get the correct idle speed. Now, you may have to do this a few times. Keep in mind, this is an older carburetor. It's never been rebuilt before. So the return spring where the throttle is, well, put it this way, there's a lot of slack in it. And when you go to buy a rebuild kit, that's one of the pieces that they recommend replacing, so you get that tight, crisp return feel when you let off the throttle. All right, you can see here I'm still making some fine-tune adjustments to the curb idle speed to get that 650 to 700 target RPM. Now, you may have to go back and forth a few times with this curb idle screw to get that perfect, because like I said before, when you adjust the idle air mixture screws, it's going to adjust your curb idle speed anyway. So you want to make sure before you even adjust them, that being the idle air screws, you want to make sure your curb idle speed is good to go. Now, hopefully, as you saw earlier, you did the 1.5 turns as a baseline, because if you don't, then you're going to be going back and forth adjusting the curb idle screw a lot. So that's why they always say, let's go ahead and get the idle air set to the 1.5, and then you'll see me, I'm doing some thumbs up here to tell you our target RPM is perfect. Okay, so now that it's perfect, we're at the 650 to 700 range. We're gonna go look at both of these air mixture screws. All right, so it's kind of important to grab a hold of the vacuum gauge, because one thing I noticed, if you just leave it tied to the rope, it likes to bounce around with the motor. So to get the most accurate results, you want to kind of hold on to it with one hand and then have your screwdriver in the other. When we first started off here, we were around 40, which you could tell this carburetor wasn't tuned right. You can see here it's kind of bouncing around a little bit. And what I'm looking for is the peak of how high we can get the vacuum to show. And to start things off, like I said, we're going as low as 40 here and dipping. I think the highest it's gone so far is 43. Okay, so you can see here on this shot, we're starting, as we've tuned it a little bit more on just using that one air mixture screw, we've been able to kind of get it to sit right around 44. And our target, hopefully we can get into the green section here. So we're going to try to target getting somewhere around 45, 46, at least in the green zone. Keep in mind, this is an older motor. As I mentioned earlier, the carburetor's never been rebuilt. So to get a really good crisp tune out of this is going to be kind of tough, but we're going to do our best to get as much as we can out of this. Now, keep in mind, if you had a fresh rebuild, you're probably going to get better numbers than what you see here. All right, so we've gone ahead here, and you can see I'm kind of going back and forth with that air mixture screw, and I'm watching that gauge. It's going to fluctuate up and down, but I'm looking for the most amount of vacuum possible out of that manifold. Once you get the most amount of vacuum possible out of the manifold, what you're going to do, okay, is you're going to stop, and you need to turn around and look at your RPM gauge. If your RPM gauge during any part of this test starts creeping up too high or even too low, in some cases, if you start to lean it out, it will start to lower itself. So what you're going to have to constantly do is go back and forth between these adjustments. Once you feel like you've gotten it to the highest amount of vacuum possible, hopefully you're still at the 650 to 700 RPM range. If you're not, you need to go back around to your curb idle screw and adjust it so you get that idle exactly where it needs to be. It's going to be a tedious process of going back and forth between the curb idle screw and this air mixture screw to get that perfect crisp amount of vacuum that you're looking for. Now, one thing I found here is you can see we're starting to creep into the green zone with the tuning. That's awesome. You'll see it bounce around, but I got this up to, I think you'll see here we get it up to right at about 46 or so, and that's about as much as you're going to get out of the tune on this side of the metering valve. If that happens, like I said, don't try to get like major improvements out of it. If you have an older carburetor, we're looking just to tune it right. We're trying to make it better. We're trying to make it more responsive. So that's really the whole reason for this whole entire process here. All right. So it looks like we're coming to an end on this side of the metering valve when it comes to air mixture screw. Probably tune it just a little bit more here. As you can see, like I mentioned earlier, we're sitting now in the green zone of the vacuum, which means we're getting a good amount. It's a little on the low end, of course, but you can see the major differences we've made by tuning this. Now, if you haven't picked up on this till now, obviously we're doing voiceover because having the camera set this close to the motor, it's super noisy. So we're going to go and do this route instead. But you can see, like I said, this is looking really good. Vacuum is getting better. It's not a quick process, as you can see here. So once you get to that point where the vacuum is good on that one side, then you go to the other. All right, so I think 45 is what we got at the other side. Let's take a look here. Yeah, we're sitting at right about 45, 46. So we're going to see if we can get it up any higher. And you see it fluctuate up to like 47 right there. We're going to keep an eye out on it. And you'll notice it has a curve to it, right? So you can only add enough air by turning it clockwise before it starts to lean out too much. And then once it leans out too much, you're going to start to stall the motor, or that needle will go back into the red zone, which is typically around 40, 42, 43, and we want to increase it as much as we can. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, it's starting to increase it a little bit more. So this is where the fine tuning goes. I could tell you, you're supposed to give it more, right? You're supposed to give it more counterclockwise turns, but that's not always the case. As I mentioned, you will notice a point where it starts to go down. And I think I demonstrate that here in a little bit. Yeah, you can see it's actually starting to hit around 40, 42, 43 as we're going counterclockwise. So this is when we start making those little eighth of a turn, right? To see if we can get the vacuum to increase a little bit more. But now, as we're giving it too much vacuum, now I'm going the other way. See it? So now I'm starting to lean it out again. It's kind of interesting because you think going counterclockwise you'll get more out of it, but it just goes to show there is a science to this to get the most amount of vacuum. So we're starting to lean it out again. We're going clockwise, and we're sitting right at about 45, 46, 47. It's getting better. And you'll see here momentarily that we're going to probably max out right at about 47. So most we're going to see. Now, periodically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the throttle and I'm going to open it up a little bit just to make sure, number one, it idles back to its normal speed again between 650 and 700, and make sure that there's no discrepancies with any of the changes that I've made to these air mixture screws. One thing that I found is once you give it a little bit of gas and let it idle back to its normal speed, it did tend to produce a little bit more vacuum afterwards. So thought that was kind of neat. But you can see here, we're pretty much at as good as we're going to get with this carburetor in its current state. It's about 47. Just so you're all aware, we've improved from right at about 40 to we jumped up seven digits there worth of vacuum. And that in the world of tuning on an old carburetor of this age that hasn't been rebuilt is a huge deal. And that's kind of what I'm shooting for when I'm showing you all this video, is how to get the most out of your carburetor. Now, like I said, I'll say it again, in this case, you can definitely tell this carburetor needs to get rebuilt. It's not the most consistent, but if we can get a little bit more life out of it before rebuilding it, which we'll probably do a rebuild on this one coming up after the season's over here. And as we get into the winter, we will work on rebuilding the carburetor. You can see with our vacuum gauge, we're fluctuating in the green zone, of course, right at about 45 and upwards of 47. So that's good. Let's go ahead now, since we've got the most amount of vacuum we're going to get out of this old carburetor, let's work on putting the throttle cable back onto the carburetor. Make sure you put your hardware in place here and make sure everything is good and attached. You don't want it falling off while you're... Okay, so that's part 2 on how to set up your air mixture screws on your marine carburetor, how to get the most amount of manifold vacuum you can out of your setup. Keep in mind, this one hasn't been rebuilt since 1994, I think it is, 93. So we got a lot of life out of this one so far, and we did improve it quite a lot by making some minor adjustments on these 2 air mixture screws. Hit that subscribe button, like the video if you thought it was helpful. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments field below, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Have a good one, everybody. Take it easy. Woo! I'm gonna call that a success, everybody.